When I walked into my daughter's living room for the pre-wedding family gathering, my son-in-law looked at me and said, with that wrinkled face, "You're going to embarrass us all in the photos." The words sliced through me like a serrated knife, each syllable tearing at my flesh. With that wrinkled face, I froze, my hand still clutching the carefully wrapped gift I'd brought. The $375 crystal vase I'd spent 3 hours selecting. My throat constricted as I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, a hot flush of shame creeping up my neck and spreading across my cheeks, making those apparently offensive wrinkles of mine burn with humiliation. For 61 years I had lived in this body, raised 2 children in it, survived a divorce and breast cancer in it, built a career and a life I was proud of, and in 7 cruel words, my son-in-law had reduced me to nothing but an embarrassment, a visual problem to be solved before his perfect day. I felt my daughter's hand on my arm, her fingers digging in slightly. "Mom," she whispered, her voice tight. "Greg didn't mean it like that. We just want everyone looking their best for the photos. I told you about that medical spa I recommended. Dr. Levine could have fitted you in last week for some quick touch-ups." Her voice was low, meant only for me, but in the sudden silence that had fallen over the gathering, every word carried. Quick touch-ups, as if the face that had smiled at her first steps, soothed her childhood fevers, and beamed with pride at her college graduation was just an old house in need of renovation. The crystal vase suddenly felt too heavy in my hands. "The photographer charges $4,000, Greg added, his voice softening slightly as he approached, as if the mention of the cost justified his concern. "We want the images to be perfect." Perfect. The word hung in the air between us. I looked around at the assembled family members, my younger daughter Ashley, shifting uncomfortably by the fireplace, my sister, Catherine, staring fixedly at her wineglass, Greg's parents nodding in subtle agreement. Not one person stepped forward to defend me. The cold reality of that silence seeped into my bones, more painful than any insult. I've always prided myself on staying composed, on being the reasonable one, the peacemaker. For 37 years as an elementary school teacher, I'd mediated conflicts and taught children the power of words. But at this moment, standing in my daughter Melissa's tastefully decorated living room with its $2,400 West Elm sectional that I had helped them buy with my retirement bonus, I couldn't find a single word to say. The metallic taste of humiliation filled my mouth as I forced my lips into what I hoped resembled a smile, and placed the vase carefully on the side table. "I understand," I said finally, though I didn't. "Not really. Not yet." I excused myself to use the bathroom, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors with each step, the sound echoing in my ears like a ticking clock. Inside, I gripped the cool marble countertop and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The face that looked back at me was one I knew well. The soft creases around my eyes from decades of laughter, the slight furrow between my brows from years of concentration, the lines around my mouth that mapped a lifetime of expressions. When had this face become something shameful, something to be fixed, hidden, apologized for? As I stood there, I heard voices drifting down the hallway. Should have talked to her sooner," Melissa was saying, her voice tense. "Mom's always been so sensitive about aging." "It's not just about the photos," Greg replied, his voice lower but still clear. "It's about standards. Someone her age should understand how these things work. Someone her age." Another knife twist. I found myself counting the years. 22 years teaching at Lincoln Elementary, 15 years at Roosevelt Middle School, 2 years of early retirement. All those years of life, reduced to a dismissive category. Someone her age. I splashed cold water on my face, careful not to smudge the makeup I'd applied so meticulously that morning. The $65 foundation that promised to minimize fine lines and restore youthful glow. My hands trembled slightly as I patted my skin dry with a plush hand towel, and I forced myself to take 3 deep breaths, an old technique I used to use before parent-teacher conferences that made me nervous. But this trembling wasn't from nervousness. It was something else, something that burned low in my stomach, unfamiliar and yet somehow recognizable. When I returned to the living room, the conversation had shifted to safer topics. the weather forecast for the wedding day, the menu details, Ashley's new job. I slipped quietly back into the gathering, accepting a glass of wine from Catherine, who squeezed my hand briefly but said nothing about what had happened. The moment of cruelty had passed, smoothed over by the social necessity to continue, by the proximity of the wedding just 3 days away. But something had fractured inside me, a crack in the foundation of who I thought I was in this family, in my daughter's life. The evening continued. I smiled at the right moments, asked appropriate questions about the wedding preparations, complimented the food, but I felt as if I were watching myself from a distance, performing the role of supportive mother while inside. That unfamiliar feeling continued to burn when Greg casually mentioned the mature special guests. Seating arrangement, a separate table away from the main party for his grandmother and her friends, and glanced meaningfully in my direction. I understood with sudden clarity. In his eyes, at 61, I belonged with the elderly, the segregated, the hidden, not with my own daughters at the family table. It was 9:37 p.m. when I finally made my exit, claiming an early start the next day. Melissa walked me to the door, her expression a mixture of concern and impatience. "You're not upset about what Greg said, are you? You know how important this wedding is to us. Everything has to be just right." I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, accomplished, 32-year-old daughter who somehow seemed like a stranger to me now, and managed another smile. "Of course not, honey. I want your day to be perfect too." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I swallowed it down along with my hurt. She hugged me briefly, already distracted by a text message that made her phone buzz, and I walked alone to my car. The drive home to my condo was a blur. The streets of Boston stretching out before me like an indistinct watercolor painting through the tears I refused to let fall. The same route I'd driven for years now looked different somehow, as if the city itself had changed while I wasn't looking. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed in the space of a single evening. I pulled into my reserved parking space at 10:15 p.m., sat motionless for several minutes, with the engine off, then finally made my way upstairs to apartment 7B, the home I'd created for myself after selling the family house following my divorce 8 years ago. Inside, I moved on autopilot, keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, shoes off, coat hung neatly in the closet. My condo was quiet, the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantel the only sound. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, still wearing the navy blue dress I'd chosen carefully for the evening. The pearl necklace Ron had given me for our 20th anniversary before he left me for his 29-year-old paralegal. I looked old, distinguished, invisible. The woman in the mirror stared back at me, her eyes filled with a question I couldn't quite articulate. I made my way to the kitchen, and poured myself a generous glass of the Cabernet I kept for special occasions. The silence of my home wrapped around me like a familiar blanket, but tonight it felt different, less comforting, more isolating. I carried my wine to the small balcony overlooking the city lights and lowered myself into the wicker chair where I often sat with my morning coffee. The night air was cool against my skin, the distant sounds of traffic creating a white noise backdrop to my thoughts. With that wrinkled face, I took a long sip of wine, letting the rich flavor fill my mouth as I rolled Greg's words over in my mind. Someone her age. In the 4 years since Melissa had brought Greg home to meet me, I had tried so hard to love him as a son, to ignore his casual arrogance, his subtle condescension. I'd contributed $30,000 toward their wedding, nearly a quarter of my retirement savings, because I wanted my daughter to have everything she dreamed of. I'd kept quiet when they chose a venue 3 hours from my home but 10 minutes from his parents' house. I'd smiled through his jokes about senior moments when I occasionally forgot a detail. I had shrunk myself, censored myself, diminished myself, all to maintain peace, to be the supportive mother, to not be difficult. I thought about all the little moments over the years, the times when Greg would interrupt me mid-sentence to clarify something I was perfectly capable of explaining myself, the way he would check his phone whenever I talked about my teaching career, the subtle eye roll he gave Melissa whenever I mentioned a book I'd read or a news story that interested me. Each incident so small, so seemingly insignificant that to call it out would have seemed petty, oversensitive, and yet, together, they formed a pattern of erasure, of dismissal, of quiet disdain for my aging female presence in their youthful world. And now I was being asked to literally erase myself, to smooth away the physical evidence of my life, to pretend that aging hadn't happened, wasn't happening, shouldn't be visible, to accept that my natural face was an embarrassment to my own family. The realization hit me with physical force, causing me to gasp, slightly as if I'd been struck. My hand tightened around the wine glass as that strange burning feeling flared again in my stomach, spreading through my chest, and suddenly, sitting alone on my balcony at 10:53 p.m. on a Tuesday night, I recognized what it was. Anger. Pure, righteous, long-suppressed anger. It was an unfamiliar sensation. I'd been raised to be nice, accommodating, to smooth over conflicts rather than create them. My generation of women had been taught that anger was unattractive, unladylike, unhelpful. I'd spent decades swallowing frustrations, disappointments, and hurts in the name of keeping peace, of being the bigger person. And where had it gotten me? Sitting alone on my balcony, nursing a wound inflicted by a man half my age, who believed my face had no right to show the passage of time. I finished my wine and went inside, moving through my nighttime routine with mechanical precision, makeup removed, teeth brushed, face moisturized with the $89 cream my dermatologist had recommended for mature skin, as if aging were a condition to be treated rather than a process to be experienced. As I completed each task, that unfamiliar anger continued to simmer inside me, not dissipating as I expected but growing stronger, more focused, taking shape like a sculpture emerging from raw clay. I slept fitfully that night, waking repeatedly from dreams where I was fading away, becoming transparent, my voice growing fainter until no one could hear me at all. At 5:17 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and made coffee, carrying the steaming mug to my small home office, where I settled at my desk. Without fully understanding why, I opened my laptop and created a new document. At the top, I typed, "Invisible." And then I began to write the events of the previous evening, Greg's exact words, Melissa's response, the silent complicity of everyone else in the room. I documented it all with the precision of the teacher I had been for nearly 4 decades, recording not just what was said but how it made me feel, the physical sensations of shame and anger, the realization that I had become invisible in my own family. The words poured out of me like water through a broken dam, years of unacknowledged slights and dismissals, suddenly finding expression. I wrote about the doctor who had addressed my questions about my own health to my daughter who had accompanied me to an appointment. I wrote about the waiter who had handed the check to my male dinner companion without even glancing in my direction. I wrote about the saleswoman who had steered me toward the appropriate clothing section with its shapeless garments and elastic waistbands. I wrote about all the ways, large and small, that the world had been telling me to disappear, to take up less space, to apologize for my continued existence once youth had departed. Writing it down was like lancing a wound, painful but necessary. When I finally stopped, the morning sun was streaming through the blinds and my coffee had grown cold. I had filled 7 pages with my neat, teacher's handwriting, transcribing a moment of humiliation with clinical detachment. I read it over, this record of a single evening that had somehow shaken the foundation of my self-perception, and felt something shift inside me. In naming what had happened, in refusing to let it dissolve into the fog of polite forgetfulness that so often smooths over family hurts, I had taken the first small step toward ... what? I wasn't sure yet, but something had changed. The woman who had driven home in tears the night before wasn't quite the same as the woman now sitting at her desk in the morning light, staring at the evidence of her own erasure. I decided to make breakfast, something I rarely did since retirement had removed the need for morning routines. As I whisked eggs for an omelet, I found myself thinking about my mother, who had died at 72 when I was in my 40s. I remembered how in her later years she had seemed to recede from view, how she would defer to my father in restaurants and social gatherings, how she would apologize for taking up space or expressing opinions. At the time, I had seen it as just her personality, her generation. Now, with the clarity of my recent epiphany, I recognized it as something else entirely, the gradual internalization of society's message that aging women should make themselves small, unobtrusive, invisible. Not me, I said aloud to my empty kitchen, the sound of my own voice startling in the quiet apartment. Not anymore. That morning, I did something I hadn't done in the 2 years and 7 months since my retirement. I got dressed with deliberate care, not in the comfortable, practical clothes I'd grown accustomed to wearing, but in a crimson blouse that brought color to my face, black tailored pants, and the silver earrings that had always made me feel elegant. I applied my makeup thoughtfully, not to hide my age but to enhance my features, and styled my silver-streaked hair that I'd been coloring religiously every 3 weeks, until 6 months ago when I'd finally decided to let nature take its course. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror on my closet door and really saw myself, perhaps for the first time in years. The woman looking back at me wasn't young, it was true, but she wasn't invisible either. The silver in her hair caught the light like metallic thread in expensive fabric. The lines around her eyes spoke of decades of laughter and tears, of witnessing both tragedy and joy. The slight softening of her jawline marked the passage of time, yes, but also the accumulation of experiences, of wisdom, of a life fully lived. This was not a face to be ashamed of or to apologize for. This was a face that had earned every line, every crease, every subtle mark of the passage of time. At 9:30 a.m., I arrived at Bellamy's, an upscale cafe where I occasionally met former colleagues for lunch. Today, however, I was meeting no one. I simply wanted to be in a public space, to exist visibly in the world. I requested a table for one, ignoring the flicker of surprise on the young hostess's face. "Just you today?" she asked, her tone suggesting this was somehow unexpected, perhaps even slightly sad. I nodded, meeting her gaze directly. "Just me," I confirmed, my voice steady. She led me to a small table near the back, partially hidden behind a decorative plant. "I'd prefer that table by the window," I said, pointing to a prime spot with a view of the bustling street. Again, that flicker of surprise. But she acquiesced with a professional smile. As I sipped my $5.75 latte and watched the world go by, I found myself noticing other women my age, how some seemed to shrink into themselves, to take up as little space as possible, while others moved with confidence, their age worn as comfortably as a favorite sweater. I observed how the waitstaff interacted differently with these women than with the young professionals or the mothers with small children, a subtle shift in attention, in eye contact, in engagement. Had I been experiencing this for years without noticing? Had I been cooperating in my own invisibility? A distinguished-looking man in his 70s sat alone at a table nearby, reading a newspaper. I noticed how the server addressed him as sir, how his solitude seemed dignified rather than pitiful, how no one had suggested tucking him away behind a plant. When he caught me looking, he nodded politely, one visible person acknowledging another. And in that simple interaction, another piece of my awakening clicked into place. The stark double standard of how society perceives aging in men versus women. His gray hair and lined face granted him gravitas, authority, distinction. My silver strands and wrinkles were seen as decline, deterioration, reasons to be hidden away. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "Need you to pick up Greg's parents from airport tomorrow. Their car service canceled." No greeting, no please. No recognition that I might have other plans. Just an assumption that I would be available, accommodating, invisible until needed for a service. I stared at the message for several minutes, that newly recognized anger flickering to life again. Then I typed, "I'm sorry, I have plans tomorrow. I can recommend a reliable car service." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then set the phone face down on the table, my heart racing as if I'd done something far more daring than simply declining a request. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed again. "What plans?" Melissa had responded, the brevity of her message conveying her disbelief. Not okay, no problem, or thanks for the recommendation, but a challenge to the very idea that I might have a life that didn't revolve around their needs. I left the message unanswered, finished my latte, and ordered another, along with a slice of lemon cake that I would have previously denied myself, for caloric reasons. As I savored each bite, I felt a small, quiet rebellion taking place, not just against Greg's cruelty or Melissa's thoughtlessness, but against all the ways I had been restricting myself, making myself smaller, less visible, less troublesome to a world that preferred its older women to fade discreetly into the background. The day before the wedding, my phone rang incessantly, Melissa calling repeatedly, then Greg, then even Ashley, who had been roped into the campaign to get me to fulfill my transportation duties. I let the calls go to voicemail, listening to the messages with a strange sense of detachment. Mom, this is ridiculous. We're counting on you. Diana, you're being very immature about this. Mom, please don't make this difficult for everyone. Each message reinforced what I was beginning to understand. My primary value to them was utilitarian. I was not a person with needs and feelings and boundaries. I was a function, a service provider, a convenience. I did, in fact, have plans that day, though they were plans I had made with myself, after declining Melissa's demand. I spent the morning at the Museum of Fine Arts, lingering in front of paintings I had rushed past on previous visits. I had lunch at an elegant restaurant where I ordered a glass of champagne because I felt like celebrating this small act of self-reclamation. I browsed in boutiques that I would normally have avoided, believing their wares too youthful or trendy for someone my age. And as the afternoon waned, I sat on a bench in the public garden, watching the swan boats glide across the pond, feeling more present, more alive, more visible than I had in years. 3 days later, I sat in the third row at my daughter's wedding, watching her marry a man who thought my face was an embarrassment. I wore the dress I had originally planned, a slate blue silk that had cost $429, rather than the more age-appropriate outfit Melissa had suggested as an alternative to fixing my face. I had not visited Dr. Levine for touch-ups. I had not apologized for my appearance. I had simply shown up, fully present, fully visible. When the photographer directed family group shots, I stood where I was placed without shrinking, without trying to hide behind others, without apologizing for taking up space in the frame. When Greg's mother commented on my brave choice to let myself go gray, I smiled and said, it wasn't brave at all. It was liberating. The startled look on her face stayed with me for hours afterward. Melissa was politely cool toward me during the reception, a subtle punishment for my failure to provide airport transportation. I accepted her distance without apology or explanation. Greg, for his part, barely acknowledged my existence, directing his conversation to others, even when I was directly beside him. His dismissal, which would have wounded me deeply just days before, now felt almost comical in its transparency. I was a woman who had refused to be erased, who had declined to make herself convenient, and he had no idea how to interact with this unexpected version of his mother-in-law. At the reception, I found myself seated at the mature special guests table, just as Greg had intended. Instead of feeling humiliated, I took the opportunity to really talk with these people. Greg's 79-year-old grandmother Evelyn, his great-aunt Patricia, and several elderly family friends. As we chatted over rubber chicken and overcooked vegetables, I discovered that Evelyn had been a civil rights activist in the 1960s, that Patricia had pioneered women's banking programs in the 1970s, that the quiet man at the end of the table had helped design the Hubble telescope. These weren't embarrassing relics to be hidden away. These were people with rich lives, tremendous accomplishments, and perspectives that spanned decades of American history. And yet here we sat, segregated from the real celebration. Our presence, tolerated rather than valued. The wine flowed freely that night, and with each glass, the conversations at our table grew more animated, more honest. They think we don't notice, Patricia said at one point, her voice low but intense. The way they speak to us, seat us, dismiss us, but we see it all. Evelyn nodded, her elegant hands wrapped around her water glass. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when age meant something, respect, wisdom. Now it's just inconvenient, unsightly. The quiet engineer, Robert was his name, spoke up then. It's worse for the women, he observed. Men become distinguished. Women become invisible. When did you first notice it happening? I asked Patricia, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. She thought for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly on the tablecloth. I was 53, she said finally. I'd just been promoted to senior vice president at the bank, the first woman to hold the position. At my first executive committee meeting, I made a suggestion about our lending policies. Complete silence. 10 minutes later, Richard, he was maybe 40 at the time, made exactly the same suggestion, almost word for word. Suddenly, everyone was nodding, commenting on what an excellent idea it was. She smiled ruefully. That was the first time I realized that it wasn't just about being a woman anymore. It was about being an older woman. Somehow, that combination made me, inaudible. Evelyn chimed in with her own story about a doctor who had dismissed her concerns about persistent pain, attributing it to normal aging until her son had accompanied her to an appointment and raised the exact same issues. Robert spoke of retirement parties where decades of contributions were reduced to jokes about memory loss and early bird specials. Around the table, each person had a moment of recognition to share. A point when they realized that society had reclassified them from person to old person, with all the diminishment that recategorization entailed. I felt something click into place as I looked around at these people who had been quite literally pushed to the margins of the celebration. When did you first notice it happening? I asked, not quite sure what it was, but somehow, knowing they would understand, and they did. For the next hour, as the music pulsed and the younger guests danced, we shared our stories. The first time a doctor had addressed a question about our health to a younger companion rather than to us directly, the shop assistants who looked through us as if we weren't there, the family members who talked about us in the third person while we sat right beside them. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same. The gradual erosion of our visibility, our voice, our perceived value. But you know what's interesting? Evelyn said, leaning forward conspiratorially. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you name it, it loses some of its power over you. The others nodded, in agreement. And I felt a surge of connection with these strangers who understood something fundamental about my experience without my having to explain it. There was power in this recognition, in the sharing of these moments when the veil had been lifted from our eyes, revealing the subtle machinery of ageism that had been operating around us and within us for years. By the time the wedding was winding down, something had shifted within me, a clarity, a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I hugged my daughter goodbye, genuinely wishing her happiness despite my new understanding of her husband. I exchanged phone numbers with Evelyn, Patricia, and Robert, promising to meet for coffee soon. Then I drove home alone, no longer crying, no longer confused, but filled with a quiet determination that felt like the beginning of something important. As I drove, I found myself thinking about my 39-year career as a teacher, about the thousands of children who had passed through my classroom. Over those decades, I had taught them reading and writing, mathematics and science. But I had also tried to teach them something more fundamental, to see each person's inherent value, to recognize that everyone deserves respect simply by virtue of being human. Had I somehow failed to apply those same principles to myself? Had I been so busy teaching others that I had forgotten to learn this most basic lesson? I thought about the books on my shelves at home, the feminist texts I'd read in college in the 1970s, the career development books I'd studied in the 1980s as I worked my way up to lead teacher, the educational theory I'd absorbed throughout my professional life, all that intellectual engagement with ideas of equality, of dignity, of human potential, and yet I had still internalized society's message that as a woman, my value diminished with each passing year, each new wrinkle, each gray hair. No more, I said aloud in my car, the words both a promise and a declaration. No more invisibility. The following Tuesday, Exactly 1 week after Greg's devastating comment, I sat once again at my desk and opened the document I had started. Below my initial entry, I began a new section, Day 7, and I wrote about the wedding, about the special table, about the conversations with my fellow segregated guests. I wrote about patterns I was beginning to recognize, about research I planned to do, about questions I wanted to explore. When I finished, I saved the document and created a new folder on my desktop. I named it the Invisibility Project. That same evening, I received a text from Evelyn. Thinking about our conversation. Wonder if you'd like to join me and some friends for lunch on Thursday. I accepted without hesitation. 2 days later, I found myself at an elegant restaurant in Back Bay, seated at a large table with Evelyn and 5 other women, ranging in age from 58 to 83. They welcomed me warmly, introducing themselves as the Reinventors, a name that immediately intrigued me. We call ourselves that because we're all in the process of reinventing our relationship with aging, explained Barbara, a former marketing executive with a chic silver bob and vibrant red glasses. Not fighting it, God knows that's a losing battle, but redefining what it means, at least for ourselves, and hopefully for others too, added Elizabeth, who I would later learn had been a professor of economics before her retirement. Individual change is fine, but we're also interested in systemic change. The personal is political, as we used to say back in the day, as we ate our $22 salads and sipped our iced teas. These women shared their stories. Barbara, a former marketing executive, had been pushed into early retirement at 62 when her company decided to revitalize their image with younger talent. Elizabeth had been divorced by her husband of 30 years who told her he needed someone who made him feel young again. Maria had been passed over repeatedly for volunteer board positions in favor of younger women with less experience. Jane had been told by her daughter that she dressed too young for her age. Helen had been addressed as young lady by a condescending store clerk when she complained about poor service. Each woman had experienced her own version of invisibility, of erasure, of being pushed aside. But unlike me, they hadn't accepted it quietly. They had found each other, formed this group, and were actively working to reclaim their place in the world. We're not fighting aging, Elizabeth explained, her eyes bright with conviction. We're fighting the culture that devalues us because of it. The others nodded in agreement. Especially for women, Barbara added. The double standard is alive and well. Men age, women expire, at least according to society. I listened, mesmerized. As they discussed their various projects, Barbara was writing a blog about ageism in the workplace. Elizabeth was organizing workshops on financial independence for women over 50. Maria was developing a directory of age-friendly businesses. This wasn't a social club or a support group in the traditional sense. It was more like a think tank, an incubator for ideas about how to navigate and challenge a world that wanted them to disappear. Think of it as consciousness raising for the gray-haired set, Jane said with a laugh. Remember those in the 70s? When we'd sit around and suddenly realize that what we thought were our personal problems were actually systemic issues affecting all women. This is like that, but with a focus on the intersection of ageism and sexism. I thought about my own awakening, how Greg's comment had cracked open something that had been building for years, how my anger had transformed into curiosity, how my isolation had given way to this moment of connection with women who understood exactly what I was experiencing. There was something powerful about naming a phenomenon, about recognizing that what felt like a personal failing or individual slight was actually part of a larger pattern, a societal structure that could be identified, analyzed, and ultimately challenged. What about you, Diana? Jane asked eventually, her kind eyes curious. What brought you to our table? I hesitated, then told them about Greg's comment, about the wedding, about my nascent invisibility project. I showed them the notes I'd been taking on my phone, the articles I'd started reading, the observations I'd been collecting. I'm not sure what I'm doing yet, I admitted. I just know I can't go back to who I was before, accepting it all, shrinking myself to make everyone else comfortable. The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then Helen reached into her elegant leather handbag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to me. "I think you should talk to my daughter," she said. "She's an attorney who specializes in age discrimination cases, not just employment, though that's her primary focus, but also housing, healthcare, financial services. She might have some interesting perspectives for your project." I took the card, running my fingers over the embossed lettering. Samantha Wilson, JD, Age Equity Legal Advocacy. On the back, Helen had written a personal phone number. "Tell her I suggested you call," she said with a smile. "And welcome to the Reinventors, Diana. I think you're going to fit right in." I left that lunch with a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years, not just because of the new connections I'd made or the potential direction for my project, but because for the first time since Greg's comment, I felt part of something larger than my individual hurt. These women had taken their personal experiences of invisibility and transformed them into action, into purpose, into meaningful change, both for themselves and potentially for others. They had refused to disappear, to apologize, to shrink themselves to accommodate societal expectations, and in doing so, they had created not just a community, but a movement. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about my daughters, about the world they would inhabit as they aged, about the attitudes they would encounter, about the messages they would receive, about their value and visibility as women moving through time. Would they face the same subtle erasure I was experiencing? Would they too internalize the belief that their worth diminished with each passing year, each new wrinkle? Or could something change between now and then? Could the work of women like the Reinventors, and perhaps now, women like me, help to shift the cultural conversation about aging, particularly for women? That lunch was the beginning of something I couldn't have imagined just 10 days earlier, when I stood frozen in my daughter's living room, wounded by my son-in-law's casual cruelty. As the weeks turned into months, the Reinventors became my anchor, my classroom, my launching pad. We met every Thursday, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes at each other's homes, occasionally at community centers or libraries where we hosted events. Through them, I began to educate myself about the pervasiveness of ageism, not just as personal insults or family dynamics, but as a systemic issue woven into the fabric of American society. I threw myself into research with the same dedication that had characterized my approach to teaching. I read books by gerontologists, sociologists, feminist scholars. I watched documentaries about aging across cultures, about the history of anti-aging industries, about communities where elders were venerated rather than marginalized. I attended webinars on age discrimination law, on media representation of older adults, on the economic impact of pushing experienced workers out of the workforce. I devoured articles, studies, podcasts, anything that helped me better understand the phenomenon I was experiencing, the structures that supported it, the potential ways to challenge it. I learned that workers over 50 were 27% less likely to get job interviews than equally qualified younger candidates. I discovered that women faced the intersecting prejudices of ageism and sexism, particularly in industries where appearance was valued over experience. I read studies showing that people over 60 were routinely given less time and attention by healthcare providers, often having their complaints dismissed as just aging. I uncovered financial practices that disadvantaged older borrowers, housing policies that segregated seniors, marketing that rendered older women virtually invisible, except as problems to be solved. The more I learned, the more I recognized patterns in my own experience. The way my doctor had started attributing various symptoms to normal aging rather than investigating specific causes. The subtle shift in how salespeople addressed me in stores. The dating app that had no category for women over 55 but allowed men to search for potential matches up to age 99. The gradual disappearance of women who looked like me from television, movies, advertising, except when selling incontinence products or medical alert systems. Each discovery both validated my growing awareness and fueled my determination to do something about it. My invisibility project evolved from personal documentation into something more structured, more purposeful. With Barbara's guidance, I started a blog where I shared my observations and research. With Elizabeth's encouragement, I began speaking at community centers about recognizing and responding to everyday ageism. With Maria's help, I developed a rating system for local businesses based on how they treated older customers. And with Jane's expertise as a former photographer, I started a portrait series capturing the beauty and dignity of women over 50, their faces unapologetically showing the lives they had lived. Melissa and I maintained contact during this period, though our relationship had shifted. Our interactions were polite but somewhat distant, neither of us quite ready to address the fracture that had occurred around the wedding. She occasionally asked about my new friends or commented on blog posts I'd shared on social media. But there was a wariness between us, a careful avoidance of deeper issues. I gave her space, understanding that she was navigating her new marriage and perhaps her own relationship. With the concepts I was exploring, Greg remained on the periphery of our communications, mentioned occasionally but never directly engaged with. 3 months after Greg's devastating comment, I received a call from Samantha Wilson, Helen's daughter. "Mom's been telling me about your project," she said after introducing herself. "I'd like to hear more about it. Would you be interested in contributing to a report we're preparing for the state legislature on how ageism affects women specifically?" I found myself agreeing immediately, a surge of excitement rushing through me at the thought of my personal experience contributing to potential policy changes. 2 days later, I sat across from Samantha in her downtown office, sharing the documentation I'd been collecting, the patterns I'd been observing, the stories I'd been gathering from other women. She listened intently, occasionally making notes, asking sharp, insightful questions. "This is exactly the kind of real-world evidence we need," she said when I finished. "The statistics tell part of the story, but these personal experiences, documented as carefully as you've done, they make the issue impossible to ignore." Samantha explained that her organization had been working for years on legal protections against age discrimination, with mixed success. "The problem," she said, leaning forward in her chair, "is that unlike other forms of discrimination, ageism is still socially acceptable. People who would never dream of making racist or sexist comments will casually make ageist ones without a second thought. And that social acceptability makes it much harder to combat at a legal or policy level." "So what's the answer?" I asked, genuinely curious about how to approach such a deeply entrenched issue. "Awareness first," she replied without hesitation. "People can't change behaviors they don't recognize as problematic. That's why the work you're doing with the reinventors is so important. You're making the invisible visible. You're naming patterns that have been normalized to the point of invisibility." She smiled. "My mother says you have a talent for articulating these issues in a way that resonates with people, that you can describe experiences that others have felt but couldn't quite put into words." Before I left her office, Samantha made an unexpected request. "We're holding a public hearing next month on age discrimination in healthcare. Would you consider testifying? Your teaching background makes you an excellent communicator, and your perspective would be valuable." The old Diana, the one who existed before Greg's comment, would have declined immediately, making excuses about not being qualified or not wanting to draw attention to herself. But the woman I was becoming didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said simply. "I'd be honored." In the weeks leading up to the hearing, I worked with Samantha and the reinventors to prepare my testimony. I gathered additional data, practiced my delivery, refined my key points. I was nervous but also energized by the purpose I had found, the voice I was reclaiming. The day of the hearing arrived, exactly 4 months and 12 days after the pre-wedding gathering that had changed everything. I wore my crimson blouse again, a talisman of sorts, and walked into the State House with my head high. The hearing room was packed with people of all ages, the atmosphere charged with the importance of the issue at hand. When my name was called, I approached the microphone with a calm I didn't entirely feel but projected nonetheless. "My name is Diana Winters," I began, my teacher's voice filling the room without strain. I am 61 years old, and until recently, I was gradually disappearing. For the next 7 minutes, the allotted time for each speaker, I shared my journey from invisibility toward reclamation. I didn't mention Greg or Melissa by name, but I described how family dynamics often reinforce societal ageism, how casual comments reflect deeper prejudices, how even loving relationships can be poisoned by cultural devaluation of aging women. I explained how this personal awakening had led me to research, to community, to advocacy. I presented the preliminary findings from surveys the reinventors had conducted with 147 women over 50 about their experiences with healthcare providers, and I concluded with a call for policy changes that would require age sensitivity, training for medical professionals, and establish clear reporting mechanisms for age-based discrimination in healthcare settings. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, then a wave of applause that startled me with its intensity. As I returned to my seat, I caught Samantha's eye. She was nodding approval, a satisfied smile on her face. Beside her sat Helen and the other reinventors, their expressions a mixture of pride and solidarity that warmed me more than any applause could. That evening, as I drove home from the hearing, my phone rang through my car's Bluetooth system. It was Melissa. We hadn't spoken much since the wedding, just brief, polite exchanges about holiday plans and a few surface-level text messages. I almost didn't answer, still protective of my newfound strength, but curiosity won out. "Mom." Her voice sounded different, hesitant, almost vulnerable. "I saw a video of you today, at some kind of government meeting. Someone shared it on Facebook." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Yes. It was a public hearing on age discrimination in healthcare," I confirmed, keeping my tone neutral. There was a pause, the silence stretching between us like a physical presence. "You were amazing," she finally said, her voice catching slightly. "I had no idea you were doing this kind of work. You seemed so powerful." The compliment was unexpected, disarming. "Thank you," I said simply, waiting to see what came next. "Mom." She hesitated again, and I could hear the struggle in her voice. "I need to apologize. For the wedding, for what Greg said, for how I handled it, for a lot of things, actually." My throat tightened as I navigated through evening traffic, emotions rising that I had carefully managed for months. "I'm listening," I said, when I could trust my voice again. What followed was a conversation unlike any we'd had before. Raw, honest, sometimes painful. Melissa admitted that she'd been embarrassed by my aging appearance, that she'd internalized society's message that women should remain perpetually youthful, that she'd valued Greg's approval over my dignity. "Hearing you speak today made me see how wrong I've been," she said. "Not just about you, but about what I'm teaching my future children about valuing people." She told me that the video of my testimony had been shared widely among her friends, that several had commented on how eloquent and compelling I was, that one had even recognized me as Melissa's mom and expressed admiration. "I've been thinking a lot about Grandma lately," she continued, referencing my mother who had been gone for almost 20 years, about how she seemed to get smaller and quieter as she got older. "I always thought that was just who she was. But watching your video today made me wonder if maybe she was experiencing what you described, that gradual erasure, and it made me realize that I've been part of perpetuating that pattern, both with her and with you." I thought about my earlier reflection on my mother, on the way she had receded from view in her later years. "I've been thinking about her too," I admitted, about how she apologized for everything, for having opinions, for taking up space, for simply existing. "I never want to become that invisible. And I don't want that for you either. When your time comes." "Greg's not happy about it," she admitted toward the end of our conversation. "He says you're making a spectacle of yourself." I felt a momentary sting, then a surprising sense of satisfaction. Good. Let him be uncomfortable. Let him see me refusing to disappear. "And what do you think?" I asked my daughter, genuinely curious about her answer. There was another pause, shorter this time. "I think you're being exactly who I needed you to be all along," showing me how to age without apology. I just didn't know it until now. By the time I pulled into my parking space at the condo, something had healed between Melissa and me. Not completely, not perfectly, but significantly. We made plans to meet for lunch the following week, just the two of us. As I ended the call and sat for a moment in my car, I marveled at how life can circle back on itself, how hurt can transform into purpose, how invisibility can become a platform for being truly seen. The following morning, I woke early and went straight to my desk, opening the Invisibility Project document to record this new development. As I typed, a notification popped up on my screen, an email from Samantha Wilson with the subject line, Opportunity. I opened it immediately, curious. Your testimony yesterday generated significant interest, she wrote. The chair of the Health Services Committee was particularly impressed and would like to establish a citizen advisory panel on ageism in healthcare. She asked if you would be interested in serving as a member. This would involve monthly meetings, reviewing policy proposals, and helping to craft guidelines for age equity in medical settings. I stared at the screen, reading the email twice to be sure I understood correctly. 6 months ago, I had been a retired teacher, living a quiet, increasingly invisible life. Now I was being invited to help shape state policy on an issue that affected millions of people, all because my son-in-law had made a cruel comment about my wrinkles, and instead of just absorbing the hurt, I had used it as a catalyst for change. That afternoon, I met with the reinventors for our regular Thursday lunch. When I shared Samantha's email, they erupted in congratulatory exclamations, raising their water glasses in an impromptu toast. This is exactly how change happens, Barbara said, her eyes bright with satisfaction. One person refuses to accept the status quo, then another, then another. Before you know it, you've started a movement. I wouldn't go that far, I laughed, though something in me expanded at the thought. I'm just one person who got tired of disappearing. Elizabeth reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That's how all movements start, Diana, with one person who refuses to accept what everyone else takes for granted. I thought about the journey I'd been on. Since that evening in Melissa's living room, from shame to anger to purpose to action, I thought about the community I'd found, the knowledge I'd gained, the voice I'd reclaimed. I thought about my mother, about my daughters, about the generations of women who had been told in 1,000 subtle ways that their worth diminished with age. And I felt a surge of determination to continue what I'd started, to push beyond my personal healing toward something that might help others refusing to be erased. As our lunch continued, the conversation shifted to plans for expanding our various projects. Maria had secured funding for her age-friendly business directory, which would now include training programs for local establishments. Jane was planning an exhibition of her portraits at a prominent gallery titled Visible Women. Helen was organizing a series of legal workshops with Samantha for older adults facing housing discrimination, and Barbara had been invited to speak at a national conference on workplace diversity about her research on ageism in hiring practices. What about you, Diana? Jane asked. What's next for the Invisibility Project? I considered the question, looking around at these women who had become my mentors, my collaborators, my friends. I think it's time to make it more visible, I said, a plan forming as I spoke. A website where people can share their stories, access resources, connect with others, maybe even a formal study documenting the economic and psychological impacts of ageism on women over 50. Barbara nodded approvingly. You'll need funding for that level of research. Have you considered applying for grants? I hadn't. The idea seemed ambitious, perhaps even presumptuous for someone who had been in this space for such a short time. But the women around the table saw no reason for hesitation. By the time we finished our lunch, I had a list of potential funding sources, offers of assistance with grant writing, and connections to academic researchers who might be interested in collaborating. I left the restaurant that day with a sense of purpose and possibility that I hadn't felt since the early days of my teaching career, when the world had seemed full of potential and I had believed in my power to make a difference. Somehow, the very thing that had been used to diminish me, my age, my wrinkles, My visible signs of having lived a long life had become the foundation for a new chapter, one with meaning and impact beyond anything I could have imagined. As I drove home from that lunch, my mind was buzzing with possibilities. I barely noticed when my phone rang, automatically answering through the Bluetooth system without checking the caller ID. Diana, a male voice I instantly recognized. Greg, my son-in-law. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, that now familiar anger flickering to life. Yes, I replied, keeping my voice level. I saw your little speech, he said, his tone a mixture of condescension and irritation. Melissa's pretty upset about it. Feels like you're airing family business in public. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was no longer the woman who had stood frozen in his living room 6 months ago. I didn't mention any names, Greg. And Melissa called me yesterday. She didn't sound upset at all. Well, she is, he insisted. And frankly, so am I. This crusade of yours is embarrassing. People are asking questions, making connections. My boss saw that video and recognized you from our wedding photos. There it was again, embarrassment. The cardinal sin in Greg's world was causing social discomfort, particularly for him. I'm sorry you feel embarrassed by my advocacy work, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. But I'm not going to stop because it makes you uncomfortable. I could almost hear him bristling through the phone. Look, Diana, I know you're going through some kind of midlife crisis or whatever, but you need to think about how this affects your family, your daughter, your future grandchildren. The mention of grandchildren was calculated, a reminder of what I might lose if I continued to misbehave. 6 months ago, it might have worked. Now, it only strengthened my resolve. Greg, I said, my voice still calm, but now carrying an edge of steel, let me be very clear. My advocacy work is not a crisis or a phase. It's meaningful contribution to an important social issue. If that embarrasses you, that's your problem to solve, not mine. And if you ever again suggest that my relationship with my daughter or future grandchildren is contingent on conforming to your comfort level, we're going to have a much more serious conversation. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. In the 6 years I had known Greg, I had never spoken to him this way directly, unapologetically, with full awareness of my own worth and boundaries. Now, is there something else you wanted to discuss? I asked when the silence had stretched for several seconds. No, he finally responded, his voice tight. I guess we're done here. I guess we are. I agreed, and ended the call. That evening, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights come on as dusk settled over Boston. My confrontation with Greg had left me feeling not anxious or guilty, as it once would have, but strangely peaceful. There was power in standing my ground, in refusing to be manipulated by his disapproval or threats about family connections. I was reclaiming not just my visibility but my voice, my agency, my right to define myself on my own terms. As I sipped my wine, I reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The hurt of Greg's comment about my wrinkled face had not disappeared. I could still feel its sting when I allowed myself to remember that moment. But what had changed was how I carried that hurt, what I had built from it. Like a grain of sand irritating an oyster, it had become the nucleus around which I was creating something of value and beauty, not just for myself, but potentially for many women like me. My phone chimed with a text message from Melissa. Lunch Tuesday still on. There's a new place near your condo I've been wanting to try. I smiled at the screen, typing back a quick confirmation. Whatever Greg might want or expect, my daughter was making her own choices about our relationship. The healing that had begun with our conversation after the hearing was continuing, creating a new foundation of mutual respect that felt more authentic than what we'd had before. Over the following months, the Invisibility Project grew beyond anything I could have anticipated. The website I created, with technical help from a young web designer who was Maria's grandson, became a hub for women sharing their experiences of ageism and strategies for combating it. My blog posts were picked up by larger media outlets, leading to interviews on local radio and television programs. The Citizen Advisory Panel on Healthcare Ageism resulted in new training requirements for medical providers throughout the state, and my collaboration with academic researchers produced a groundbreaking study on the economic impact of pushing experienced women out of the workforce, a report that was cited in congressional testimony on age discrimination laws. Throughout this period, I maintained regular contact with Melissa. Our relationship had evolved into something new, not the somewhat infantilizing mother-daughter dynamic of before, where I had been expected to accommodate and support without needs of my own, but a more equal connection between two adult women with mutual respect and genuine curiosity about each other's lives. Greg remained distant, civil when we encountered each other at family gatherings, but never warm. I accepted this limitation without resentment, understanding that his discomfort with my refusal to be invisible was his issue to resolve, not mine. 1 year to the day after Greg's devastating comment, I stood at a podium in a hotel conference room, looking out at the faces of nearly 200 women who had gathered for the first annual Visibility Summit. The event, organized by the Reinventors with support from Samantha's legal advocacy group and 3 corporate sponsors, had sold out weeks in advance. Women had come from across the Northeast to attend workshops on combating workplace ageism, navigating healthcare bias, building financial security, and reclaiming social relevance. A year ago today, I began my keynote address. I was told that my wrinkled face would be an embarrassment in family photos. A murmur ran through the audience: recognition, indignation, solidarity. That comment could have diminished me. In fact, for a little while, it did. But then something unexpected happened. I got angry, and that anger became curiosity, and that curiosity became research, and that research became action. I went on to share the journey of the Invisibility Project, how it had grown from personal documentation to a funded research initiative with 3 part-time staff members and a network of volunteer contributors across the country. I described our website that had received over 50,000 visits in its first 6 months. Our database of more than 1,500 personal testimonies about experiences with ageism, our toolkit for businesses wanting to create age-friendly environments, our growing media presence as recognized experts on women's experience of aging in America. But what I'm most proud of, I continued, is not what we've accomplished as an organization, but what each of us has accomplished personally by refusing to disappear. I looked out at the audience, women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even a few in their 90s. Women with gray hair and dyed hair, wrinkles and smooth skin, business suits and casual wear, traditional styles and avant-garde fashion. Women who had come to learn, to connect, to reclaim their rightful place in the visible world. Look around this room. I invited them. This is what power looks like. This is what wisdom looks like. This is what refusing to be erased looks like. We have earned every line on our faces, every gray hair on our heads, every story etched into our bodies, and we will not apologize for showing the evidence of our lives. The applause that followed was thunderous. Women rising to their feet in a standing ovation that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. As I stepped away from the podium to introduce the next speaker, I caught sight of a familiar face in the back of the room, Melissa. She hadn't told me she was coming, but there she was, applauding with everyone else, her expression a mixture of pride and something that looked like awe. Beside her stood a woman I recognized as one of her closest friends from college. They had come together to hear me speak, to be part of this gathering, to witness this movement that had grown from a single painful comment. Later, as attendees mingled during the coffee break, Melissa made her way to where I stood chatting with Barbara and Elizabeth. "Mom, that was incredible," she said, embracing me warmly. I had no idea how big this had become. I introduced her to my colleagues, watching with pleasure as she engaged them in conversation about the research they'd been presenting. The young woman who had once been embarrassed by my aging appearance was now genuinely interested in the work I was doing to challenge that very attitude. "Is Greg here too?" I asked during a lull in the conversation, though I already knew the answer. Melissa shook her head. "No, he's still not comfortable with all this." A shadow passed briefly over her face. We're working through some things in counseling. I'm starting to recognize patterns I don't like, ways of thinking I've accepted without questioning. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Whatever was happening in her marriage was her journey to navigate, though I hoped she was finding her own voice just as I had found mine. As the summit continued throughout the day, I found myself repeatedly drawn back to this moment of reflection, how a single cruel comment had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just my life but potentially the lives of many others. The wrinkles that Greg had found so embarrassing had become, in a sense, my credential, my lived experience of the very issue I was now addressing on a systemic level. The invisibility he and others had tried to impose on me had become the platform from which I was helping other women become more visible, more valued, more vocal. That evening, the summit concluded with a reception where women exchanged contact information, made plans for local action groups, and celebrated the connections they had formed. As I circulated through the crowd, women stopped me to share their stories, to thank me for creating this space, to tell me how the day had inspired them to address ageism in their own communities and families. One woman in her late 70s gripped my hands tightly and said, "Today is the first time in 15 years I've felt truly seen." When the last attendees had departed and only the reinventors remained, we gathered in a small circle, raising glasses of champagne that Samantha had arranged to have delivered. To visibility, Barbara toasted, her eyes bright with satisfaction at what we had accomplished. To community, added Elizabeth. To change, said Maria. To resilience, offered Jane. To the future, said Helen, with a meaningful glance at her daughter. Two wrinkles, I concluded, touching my glass to each of theirs in turn, celebrating the lines on my face that had once been deemed an embarrassment but had become instead the map leading me home to myself. That night, back in my condo, I stood before my mirror and really looked at my face, the face that had launched an unexpected journey from invisibility toward impact. I traced the lines around my eyes, the creases beside my mouth, the subtle loosening along my jawline. These were not flaws to be fixed or evidence of decay to be hidden. They were the physical record of a life fully lived, of laughter and tears, concentration and relaxation, surprise and knowing, loss and discovery. They told the story of who I was, who I had been, who I was becoming. With that wrinkled face, I whispered to my reflection, reclaiming Greg's words and transforming them from weapon to affirmation. You're going to change the world. And for the first time in my life, looking at my aging face in the mirror, I felt not resignation or regret but a fierce, uncomplicated pride in my journey, in my strength, in my refusal to disappear. With every line, every silver hair, every visible sign of my 62 years, I was exactly who I needed to be, not despite my age, but because of it. Not invisible, but radiantly, defiantly present. And I was just getting started.